The Unfiltered Human on the Fringe episode 38, The Silence Between Words, The Power of Pause in Relationship. Welcome back to The Unfiltered Human on the Fringe, the space where we sit with the emotions most people rush past and name the shadows that shape everyday life. We are now journeying through the fourth arc of this series, the relational arc, mirrors, bridges, and boundaries. This arc is about the fragile, powerful spaces between self and other, intimacy, conflict, belonging, and the choices that define connection. If you've just found us here, the road behind has carried us through three arcs: shadow emotions, where we unearth the feelings we're taught to bury; integration and alchemy, where we explored how pain can be turned into power; and ashes to architecture, the rebuild, where we asked what it means to begin again after collapse. Today we step into the world of silence, the words we don't say, the pauses we hold, and the weight of what lingers unspoken. Silence can be a balm or a barrier. It can connect us more deeply than words, or fracture us with absence. It is not neutral, it is charged with meaning. In this episode, we'll explore silence as presence, silence as avoidance, and silence as a mirror for what we dare not say. You'll hear personal reflections on moments when silence healed, and moments when it harmed. Alongside that, we'll ground our exploration in psychological insight and offer practices for noticing the spaces between words in your relationships. Because sometimes the loudest truths are the ones left unsaid. So let's begin. Between noise and nothing. Words carry weight, but silence carries shape. It stretches between us like a rope, sometimes a lifeline, sometimes a noose. In relationships, what isn't said can echo louder than what is. A pause after a question, the unsent text, the glance that lingers but never forms into speech. All of these moments carve meaning into our interactions. Silence can soothe, signaling safety and presence. But it can also wound, communicating absence, neglect, or withdrawal. What makes silence powerful is not its emptiness, but the fact that it is never truly empty. It always says something, whether we intend it to or not. The unspoken language. This first part explores the dual edges of silence, its capacity to deepen intimacy when shared, and its potential to fracture connection when it becomes avoidance. We'll move from personal stories into psychological insight, tracing how silence is one of the most underestimated forces in human connection. Themes and attributes silence as connection. The pause that communicates, I'm here with you, without words. Silence as fracture. The absence that feels like rejection or abandonment. Nonverbal presence. How tone, gesture, and breath fill silence with meaning. Interpretation and misinterpretation. Why silence is rarely neutral and how context defines it. Personal reflection. There was a friendship I valued deeply, but the silences between us started to speak louder than our words. We would sit together, and at first, those moments of quiet felt comforting, like no performance was needed. But over time, those same pauses began to stretch, heavy and awkward. I noticed myself filling them with nervous chatter, trying to bridge what felt like an invisible distance. The turning point came during a walk where I shared something vulnerable. I expected a response, reassurance, even just a nod, but what came instead was silence. At first, I told myself they were being thoughtful, but as the silence dragged on, it felt like an absence, as though my words had landed in a void. That unacknowledged moment stuck with me longer than many arguments. Later, I realized they thought silence was a way of giving space, of not intruding. But for me, silence in that moment didn't feel like presence. It felt like being unseen. That experience made me question not only how others interpret silence, but also how I use it. Do I withdraw into silence as a shield, or do I offer it as an invitation? Psychological insight psychologists often describe silence as a form of nonverbal communication, a channel where meaning is transmitted not through words, but through timing, gesture, and presence. Knapp and Hall, 2010. Unlike verbal language, silence is ambiguous. It forces interpretation, and interpretation often reveals more about the listener than the speaker. This connects with Edward T. Hall's theory of proxemics, 1966, which explores how physical space shapes meaning. Silence is like an invisible distance, sometimes respectful, sometimes cold. In intimate relationships, silence can resemble closeness. Two people sitting in quiet, breathing in rhythm, needing no words. In strained relationships, the same silence can feel like a chasm. I've experienced both. In one relationship, silence was grounding. We could sit for hours without speaking, and it felt like the deepest form of presence. In another, silence was weaponized, a withdrawal that signaled disapproval or control, the infamous silent treatment. In the first, silence said, I see you. In the second, it said, you don't matter. The difference highlights a truth. Silence isn't neutral. It's a message. And just like language, it requires context, consent, and clarity. Insight prompts. When has silence in your life felt like connection? When has it felt like absence or rejection? Do you tend to use silence to invite presence or to protect yourself? Theory in action. This week, notice a moment where silence arises in conversation. Instead of rushing to fill it, pause. Ask yourself, is this silence saying, I'm here or I'm gone? Try leaning into one silence as presence, making eye contact, breathing together, or simply staying with it, and see what shifts. When silence connects, there are moments when silence feels like the deepest expression of intimacy. Lovers lying in bed, not needing to speak. Friends watching the world pass by without commentary. Families sitting around a fire, letting warmth and presence speak louder than words. In these spaces, silence becomes a thread, invisible but strong enough to weave a connection. The irony is that while silence is often feared as emptiness, in its most profound form, it can hold more meaning than any sentence. Silence is not just the absence of words, it's the presence of being. Silence as connection, silence can be a presence, not just an absence. There are moments where silence feels like a shared breath, a space where words would only get in the way. This kind of silence doesn't create distance, it deepens connection. It's the quiet of two people sitting side by side without the pressure to perform, where the bond is felt rather than spoken. What isn't said can be louder than any argument, carrying sharpness and rejection. This kind of silence fractures, not because of words spoken, but because of what has been withheld. Themes and attributes silence as sacred space, where words would only dilute what's already understood. Trust in stillness, allowing the pause without rushing to fill it. Embodied presence, how silence roots us into the moment with another. The language of breath, quiet rhythms aligning people beyond speech. Personal reflection, I remember one evening on holiday in Sicily with a partner where almost nothing was said. We sat outside our holiday flat, under an extended retractable porch, sipping limoncello, watching the sun fall behind the horizon. Normally, I'd feel pressure to talk, to make the moment meaningful with words. But instead, there was this sense that speaking would break something delicate. The silence itself was carrying the meaning. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was one of the rare times I felt completely understood without explanation. The air seemed to thicken with presence, their breathing, my breathing, the soft hum of the world around us. We were in tune without needing to signal it. That silence left more of an imprint on me than many long conversations because it felt like a form of recognition. You don't need to perform here. You're enough as you are. Psychological insight silence as connection aligns with Carl Rogers' concept of unconditional positive regard in humanistic psychology. Rogers argued that deep, transformative relationships don't always need words. They need presence, acceptance, and attunement. Sometimes silence is the attunement, a way of saying, I accept you without needing to change or fix you. This is also echoed in mindfulness-based research, Kabat-Zinn, 1990, which shows that shared presence, simply being still with another, can reduce anxiety and increase perceived closeness. Silence doesn't strip connection. It can intensify it by removing the clutter of language. I've felt this most strongly in moments where I didn't have to narrate myself. Sitting in silence with someone who didn't demand an explanation felt like being freed from performance. It reminded me that words are tools, but not always the most honest ones. Insight prompts. Think of a time silence deepened your connection with someone. What made it feel safe rather than awkward? Do you allow silence in your relationships, or do you rush to fill it out of habit or fear? Theory in action. Try spending intentional silence with someone close to you this week, a walk without phones, a shared meal with pauses, or just sitting together without filling every gap. Notice whether silence feels heavy or light, distant or intimate? Reflect afterwards on what the silence communicated that words could not. When silence fractures, but silence can just as easily take on a different weight. Instead of intimacy, it can become a wall. What isn't said can be louder than any argument, carrying sharpness and rejection. This kind of silence fractures, not because of words spoken, but because of what has been withheld. The weight of withheld words. It's the unreturned message, the conversation cut short, the moment where someone looks away instead of answering. These silences aren't restful, they buzz with tension. They feel like unanswered questions lodged in your chest. And unlike spoken conflict, there's no resolution point, no clear landing. You're left replaying every detail in your head, trying to decode what the absence of words was meant to say. Themes and attributes ambiguous silence, when silence leaves us uncertain, unsure if it signals care, rejection, or indifference. Emotional withholding, using silence as a tool for control, punishment, or avoidance. Invisible conflict, the fights that never happen but still leave scars. Longing for clarity, the ache for someone to simply speak, even if the truth hurts. Personal reflection. I can remember a friendship where silence started to take on a life of its own. At first, we had easy conversations that stretched for hours, no subject off limits, no sense of running out of things to say. But when tension entered, the dynamic shifted. Suddenly, silences appeared where once there had been flow. Messages that used to come instantly started arriving hours later, sometimes not at all. I'd replay the exchanges in my head. Did I say something wrong? Did I cross a line? But the silence gave me nothing to work with. When I finally asked, the response was vague, dismissive even. I've just been busy. Yet the tone, the avoidance, the delay, they all carried more meaning than the words themselves. What hurt most wasn't an argument. It was the absence of one. If they had told me directly that something had shifted, it would have stung, but at least I would have known where I stood. Instead, the silence stretched on, like a shadow over everything, and in that space of not knowing, I felt myself shrinking, questioning my worth, and carrying weight that was never really mine. It made me realize that silence doesn't always mean peace. Sometimes it's the loudest fracture of all. Psychological insight psychologists call this stonewalling, the deliberate withdrawal of communication in moments of tension. Gottman, 1999. Unlike healthy silence, which gives space for reflection, stonewalling is marked by disengagement. It's not about taking time to think, it's about shutting the door entirely. I've experienced this not just in friendships, but in work dynamics too. Once, a colleague who disagreed with my approach didn't voice their concern directly. Instead, they responded with clipped one-word replies, or worse, none at all. The silence wasn't neutral, it was loaded, and it had a clear psychological effect. I became hyper-vigilant, second-guessing my every word, adjusting my behavior to avoid more withdrawal. This mirrors what researchers describe as the punitive function of silence, when it's used as a form of control. The silent person dictates the emotional climate of the relationship without ever saying a word. Another useful lens is Paul Watzlawick's axiom of communication, 1967. One cannot not communicate. Even in silence, messages are being sent. A refusal to speak is still a message, often a more powerful one than words themselves. But the danger is that without clarity, the recipient has to supply their interpretation. And most of us, when faced with silence, fill in the blanks with self-blame. The difference between restorative silence and fracturing silence lies in intent. One makes space, the other creates distance. One holds, the other withholds. Recognizing that difference can be the first step in protecting ourselves from the slow erosion of relationships where silence becomes a weapon. Insight prompts. Have you ever experienced silence that felt more painful than words? How do you usually respond when someone withdraws instead of addressing a conflict? In what ways might you have used silence, consciously or not, as a form of self-protection? Theory and action. This week, notice the silences in your relationships. If you sense ambiguity, instead of filling the gaps with self-blame, try to name it. Simple. I'm sensing some distance. Is everything okay? Can bring unspoken tension into the open. And if you're the one pulling back, ask yourself, is my silence giving space or creating confusion? Even a short acknowledgement like, I need time to think, but I'll get back to you, can turn a potentially painful silence into a boundary that still honors connection. Silence as a language of present silence isn't always an absence. At its best, it becomes a kind of shared language, a way of saying I'm here with you without needing to move our lips. There are moments when words would only dilute what is already known, when the stillness itself holds the truth more powerfully than sentences ever could. Think of two friends watching the sunset without speaking, or a loved one holding your hand through grief. These are silences charged with presence, a reminder that connection isn't always measured by dialogue. The depth of wordless connection. The most profound intimacy is sometimes found in what remains unspoken. But to reach that place, silence has to be chosen, not imposed. It has to be held in trust, not in avoidance. Otherwise, the same quiet that could heal becomes a wound instead. Themes and attributes restorative silence, quiet that brings comfort and grounding rather than distance. Attunement, the subtle art of being in sync with another without words. Sacred pause, moments where silence communicates more than speech. Presence over performance, when being with someone outweighs the need to impress or reassure. Personal reflection. One of the times I learned to appreciate silence most deeply was during a difficult season with someone I cared about. They were going through a loss, and my instinct at first was to try to say something wise, to offer words that might ease their pain. But every time I opened my mouth, it felt clumsy, like I was reaching for a fix that didn't exist. Eventually, I stopped trying to fill the space. I just sat with them. Sometimes we would listen to the rain outside. Sometimes we would share a drink in complete silence. At first, I felt useless, as though my role was to provide comfort through words. But then I realized something had shifted. The absence of speech wasn't empty, it was holding us both. In that silence, there was no pressure to perform, no need to dress up feelings with explanations. It was simply the presence itself that mattered. And looking back, I think that time of sitting together wordlessly communicated more than any carefully chosen phrase ever could. It reminded me that real connection often lives beneath language, in the trust that silence won't be misused. Psychological insight. The psychology of silence as presence can be linked to Carl Rogers' concept of unconditional positive regard, 1959. Rogers suggested that when people feel fully accepted and understood, without judgment or interruption, they experience healing and growth. Often, this doesn't require words at all. Simply being in the company of someone who isn't rushing to fill the space allows a person to feel safe enough to process their emotions internally. I noticed this myself once in a mentoring role. A younger colleague came to me overwhelmed, and instead of offering advice, I just listened, and when they stopped speaking, I didn't rush in. I nodded, stayed quiet, and gave them the room to continue if they wanted. Later, they told me that moment of silence was what helped them most, because it gave them permission to hear their own thoughts out loud. Another perspective comes from mindfulness and Buddhist traditions, where silence is considered a practice of deep presence. It's not the absence of sound, but the cultivation of awareness. In a relationship, this kind of silence creates an energetic field where both people can feel seen without performance. The key difference between harmful silence and healing silence lies in intent and attunement. One pushes away, the other leans closer without words. Insight prompts. When have you experienced silence that felt like connection rather than distance? Do you find it easy or difficult to sit quietly with someone you care about? Why? What does it reveal about you when you rush to fill silence with words? Theory in action experiment this week with intentional silence. In one meaningful interaction, resist the urge to respond immediately. Instead, allow space. Notice how the other person responds. Do they lean in, relax, share more? Or does the silence make them uncomfortable? Observe the dynamics and reflect on how choosing silence might deepen presence instead of weakening it. When silence becomes a wound, silence can hold us, but it can also haunt us. When words are withheld not out of presence, but out of fear, avoidance, or manipulation, silence turns from sanctuary into fracture. What isn't said can sometimes speak louder than what is. A partner who refuses to answer, a parent who withdraws their voice, a friend who goes quiet when you need them most. In these moments, silence doesn't communicate connection, it creates distance. It leaves us alone with our own stories, forcing us to interpret the gaps without guidance. And often, what we imagine in the absence of words is far harsher than the truth might have been. The fracture of what isn't said. This is the paradox. The same quiet that can hold intimacy can also erode it, and the line between the two is often razor thin. Themes and attributes avoidant silence, the withdrawal that leaves wounds instead of comfort, ambiguity, the tension of having to guess what silence means, power dynamics when silence is used to punish, manipulate, or control, loneliness in proximity, the ache of being next to someone yet feeling unseen because they will not speak, personal reflection. One of the most difficult silences I've lived through came in a close relationship where conflict was always avoided. Instead of arguments, there was withdrawal. I would notice the room go quiet, a kind of cold silence that didn't feel like peace but punishment. I never knew whether I'd done something wrong or whether they simply couldn't handle confrontation. What struck me was the way I filled in the blanks. Because no explanation was given, my mind would loop endlessly. Was it me? Did I say the wrong thing? Are they angry? The silence became louder than any argument could have been. Over time, I realized I was carrying both sides of the dialogue, my own unease and the unspoken weight of their silence. That experience left me with a sharper awareness of how damaging unaddressed quiet can be. It reminded me to check myself too. When I pull away in silence, am I truly offering space, or am I unconsciously creating distance that harms? Psychological insight psychologists have studied this dynamic under concepts like the demand, withdrawal pattern in conflict, Christensen and Heavy, 1990. One partner pursues dialogue, while the other withdraws into silence. Over time, this creates escalating tension. The more one demands, the more the other withdraws and the gap widens. From my own experience, I've seen how this pattern feeds insecure attachment dynamics. Silence in these cases isn't neutral. It triggers deep fears of abandonment or rejection, especially in those with anxious attachment styles. It also intersects with power. Silence can function as a form of stonewalling, which the Gottman Institute identifies as one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse in relationships. But beyond psychology, there's also a philosophical lens. Søren Kierkegaard once wrote that the greatest danger, that of losing one's own self, may pass quietly as if it were nothing. In this sense, silence can be existentially corrosive because it erodes not just trust in another, but also our ability to trust our own interpretations of reality. Insight prompts. Have you experienced silence that felt like punishment rather than presence? How do you typically respond when someone withdraws into silence? Do you chase, fill the gap, or withdraw? In what ways might you be using silence unintentionally to avoid discomfort? Theory in action. This week, notice the silences you create. The next time you feel tempted to withdraw into silence after conflict, pause and ask, is this silence creating space for healing, or am I using it as avoidance? Try naming your silence instead, saying, I need a moment, or I'm not ready to talk yet, so that the other person knows the silence has intention rather than ambiguity. The weight of unspoken words. There are times when silence lingers long after it should have broken. We leave words unsaid, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of pride, sometimes because we simply don't know how to speak what we feel. But the longer silence stretches, the heavier it becomes. Unspoken words often carry a double burden. What wasn't said in the moment and what accumulates in the absence of speech. Left unresolved, this weight can distort memory and harden into resentment. Silence as the space between wounds and repair. A pause that might have once been a chance to breathe becomes a canyon we no longer know how to cross. And yet, within that silence, there is also possibility. The gap between words can be a bridge if we choose to step onto it, if one person dares to name what has been unsaid. Themes and attributes, the accumulation of silence, how small unspoken moments build into larger fractures. Fear of speaking, the vulnerability in breaking silence first. Resentment and memory, how unaddressed quiet can twist the way we remember the past. The possibility of repair, the chance to turn silence into the opening for truth. Personal reflection, I remember a friendship that slowly unraveled, not through conflict, but through silence. There was no single explosive argument, just a steady accumulation of things left unsaid. Little irritations, disappointments, and questions about loyalty, none of it voiced. I told myself that not speaking was a form of grace, that I was sparing us both discomfort. But with each unspoken thought, I grew more distant. The silences became heavier, until one day I realized we hadn't really spoken in months, though we still saw each other. The relationship was hollowed out, not by what we said, but by what we didn't. Looking back, I see how afraid I was of breaking the silence. I didn't want to risk rejection or create conflict, so I let absence speak for me. But in doing so, I lost the very connection I was trying to preserve: psychological insight. This dynamic can be understood through the lens of emotional suppression. Gross and Levinson, 1993. When we avoid expressing emotions, whether through silence or restraint, the emotions don't disappear. Instead, they intensify internally and often resurface in indirect or unhealthy ways. In my own experience, the suppressed frustrations in that friendship eventually leaked out in passive avoidance. I would decline invitations, give short replies, or withhold enthusiasm, not because I didn't care, but because the unspoken weight had become too much. A related concept is the spiral of silence. Noel Newman, 1974, a theory from communication studies. It suggests people remain silent when they fear their opinions are in the minority, leading to even more silence, which then reinforces the illusion that no one else feels the same way. In my case, I feared my feelings wouldn't be understood or reciprocated, so I stayed quiet, and my friend likely did the same. Together, we built a wall of silence neither of us intended. This illustrates how silence, left unchecked, isn't neutral. It shapes reality. It can redefine a relationship not by what is spoken, but by what is withheld. Insight prompts. What relationships in your life carry unspoken words? What sits in the silence between you? Do you tend to see silence as a way of keeping peace, or do you recognize it as avoidance in disguise? When you recall past relationships, do you remember what was said or what was left unsaid? Theory in action. Choose one relationship in your life where silence has grown heavy. Without trying to resolve everything at once, practice naming just one unspoken thing. You might say, I've realized there's something I haven't said, and it feels important to share. Notice what shifts in them, in you, in the space between. Often, it's not about perfect words, but about breaking the silence itself. Silence as presence, not all silence is fracture. Sometimes silence is the purest form of presence we can offer. To sit beside someone in their grief without rushing to fix. To hold space for a friend who doesn't yet have words. To lie next to someone you love, listening only to the rhythm of breath. When quiet speaks louder than words, these silences don't weigh us down, they ground us. They remind us that connection isn't built solely on language, but on presence, attention, and attunement. The right silence can speak what words never could. Themes and attributes silence as comfort. The safety of being with someone who doesn't demand performance. Attuned presence, listening not to respond but simply to witness. Embodied connection, how stillness can feel more intimate than speech. The language beyond words, recognizing when silence communicates love, care, or solidarity. Personal reflection. One of the most profound experiences of silence in my life came when I sat with someone close to me after a loss. I had no idea what to say, and for once I didn't try. I simply sat with them in quiet, offering presence without words. At first it felt awkward, like I was failing to provide comfort. But then I noticed how they relaxed into the silence, how their breathing slowed, how the absence of chatter seemed to give them space to simply be. Later they told me that moment meant more than any words could have. It taught me that silence can be a gift when it isn't used to avoid, but to accompany. The quiet said, "You're not alone, I'm here." Psychological insight. This speaks to Carl Rogers' concept of unconditional positive regard in humanistic psychology. Rogers believed that true healing relationships are built not on constant verbal affirmation, but on authentic presence and acceptance. Silence can embody this, a form of being with that requires no justification or explanation. Another lens comes from nonverbal immediacy behaviors in communication research. Studies show that eye contact, body orientation, and physical stillness often communicate more emotional closeness than words. Silence, paired with attuned body language, can create a depth of intimacy language sometimes disrupts. My own example of sitting in silence during grief demonstrated this. What felt like doing nothing was actually an act of deep empathy, allowing the other person to feel safe in their vulnerability without me rushing to cover it with words. Insight prompts. When was the last time silence felt like connection rather than distance in your life? Do you tend to rush to fill silences, or can you hold them without discomfort? What might change in your relationships if you trusted silence as part of the conversation? Theory and action. This week, practice silence as presence. In a conversation with someone you trust, resist the urge to immediately respond or reassure. Instead, allow a few moments of quiet after they've spoken. Notice how the pause deepens the interaction and whether the other person feels more heard, not less. The language beyond speech silence is not emptiness. It is a language all its own, sometimes heavy, sometimes healing, sometimes holding more truth than words ever could. In our relationships, silence can wound when it avoids, but it can also mend when it accompanies. The difference lies not in the absence of words, but in the intention behind them. To listen without interrupting, to sit without filling, to love without needing to explain, these are forms of silence that remind us that connection is not always spoken. You've been listening to the Unfiltered Human on the Fringe. Until next time, stay human, stay awake, and trust the spaces between words to teach you as much as the words themselves. James Miller. If you found value in today's episode, you may also be interested in my broader project, The Inversiverse, a series exploring the hidden architecture of perception, identity, control, and consciousness. Across 20 episodes, The Inversiverse dissects indoctrination, language, media manipulation, dark psychology, belief systems, and the evolution of self in the digital age. You can find all episodes of The Inversiverse on Facebook, YouTube, Rumble, and Substack by searching this place called Earth. These ideas aren't shared to convince you, but to invite you to think, feel, and perceive more consciously in a world designed to keep you distracted. Overview of the Inversiverse, a journey through the mirrors of mind, culture, and control. Episodes 1 to 3 introduce foundational ideas around indoctrination, perception, and manipulation. Episode 4 explores how language, symbols, and cultural norms are used to shape thought. Episode 5 investigates control systems, media narratives, and the illusion of choice. Episodes 6 to 7 dives into collective belief structures and the psychology of mass behavior. Episode 8 focuses on marketing, control theory, game theory, and critical thinking. Episode 9 covers love, relationships, human mating, gender dynamics, and red-blue pill ideologies. Episode 10 unpacks dark psychology, the occult, Satanism, and the dark triad personality types. Episode 11 The Simulated Self examines identity, ego, and the rise of post-human consciousness. Episode 12 The Spell of the Mind inquires into language, illusion, and physiology of thought. Episode 13 Conscious Seduction journeys through persuasion, propaganda, and the unseen forces of the mind. Episode 14 The Myth of Sanity sheds light on madness, genius, and the edge of perception. Episode 15 The Algorithmic Mind probes influence, identity, and invisible architects. Episode 16 The Noise of Knowing reveals overload, obsession, and the age of infinite information. Episode 17 Belief Machines delves further into language, desire, and the engine of reality. Episode 18 Submerged Signals examines how the unseen shapes the self. Episode 19 The Alchemy Within Traces, Food, Frequency, and the Forgotten Intelligence of the Body. Episode 20 Encoded Flesh scrutinizes and opens up to the forgotten language of the body, DNA, and biological consciousness.